Even before Ruin, the Mimic had everyone talking, but since Ruin, people are talking even more. So, let's talk even more. I see a lot of people, when talking about the Mimic, either misinterpreting what it's doing, misinterpreting what people are suggesting, and just being really confused about how certain things happen. In this video, I'm going to be doing my best to explain the Mimic as well as I can. And what I mean by that is, I'll be explaining why the Mimic is Glitch Trap, but also what the difference is between the Mimic and Glitch Trap. For the most part, the video is all about exactly what the Mimic is mimicking, how and why it's mimicking them, and what exactly the Mimic's goal is with the information gathered by who he's mimicking. It's basically just going to be telling the whole story about the Mimic. I should also mention that this theory largely revolves around the Tales from the Pizzaplex books being in the game's timeline, so if you haven't already, check out my video on why these books are in the games, and if you don't believe they are, then you don't have to watch the video, or you can just watch for fun to get an alternate opinion. Either way, I hope you guys enjoy, and let's get started. There's a lot of people who kind of misinterpret theories about the Mimic. I've talked about the Mimic in a lot of theories since its story, but that's just because there is a decent amount to talk about. But a lot of people have been misunderstanding ideas that I and many others have been suggesting. I've talked many times about how the Glitch Trap virus is the Mimic program, and I've provided the evidence enough times as is. So what I'm gonna do now is that. Again. But I'll try my best to do it more briefly this time while also compiling more of the evidence. Obviously, we know that the Mimic has the Mimic 1 program in it, which mimics the things that it observes. Glitch Trap in FNaF VR is said to be watching Tape Girl in one of the tapes, and it seemed like he was looking in the window and seeing what she was doing, not attacking, observing her, and then later, in the main menu screen after Tape Girl was already possessed by Glitch Trap and possibly killed or gone, Glitch Trap speaks in her voice, repeating her voice lines. He mimics her. I would like to say though that while he definitely is mimicking her voice in the main menu, he isn't mimicking her in the tapes themselves. She's simply possessed by him there. Speaking of the Mimic 1 program though, that program also appears in the Storyteller, and the program is spread throughout the Pizzaplex through a giant tree. The program goes into the animatronics and alters their behavior, making them more eerie and aggressive and just negative in general, and the games tell us that Glitch Trap is what caused that. Also, since the Mimic was spread throughout the Pizzaplex through a tree, it's very interesting to note that the door to Glitch Trap in Princess Quest has a tree on it, not to mention that the Storyteller's tree is near a castle theater, and the door in Princess Quest has castle walls on it along with the tree. In FNaF VR, there's also the secret Endo image we used to be able to find. When it was first discovered, it was found using misplaced numbers and letters in the source code of scottgames.com. Those numbers and letters were 0RGN, which basically spell out origin. Since this code is tied to the endoskeleton in the teasers for FNaF VR, which has Glitch Trap in it, it's basically saying that Glitch Trap's origins are tied to this endoskeleton, which likely means that it's the Mimic and that the Mimic is Glitch Trap. And finally, there's the Monty Within, which I plan to do a theory and detail video on in the near future, but the story basically has Monty act pretty much exactly like Glitch Trap, and the Monty code that possessed Kane was part of an arcade game, which apparently had amazing technology, and the program of Monty in the arcade game seemed to mimic what Kane was doing. Glitch Trap is the Mimic. One of the problems some people have with Glitch Trap being the Mimic is the idea of a computer program possessing a human, but the Monty Within straight up shows that's possible, so that isn't an argument. The Mimic story also shows that the Mimic can learn to act for itself. It obviously does mimic things, but it also responds to things, meaning it can think for itself, so it doesn't have to have observed someone taking over a mind and possessing people. It just figured out how to do that itself. And it doesn't matter how, because we've seen that it can in the Monty Within. And Afton also definitely isn't possessing the Mimic as Glitch Trap at all, because that completely defeats the purpose of the Mimic. If Burn Trap is Afton, that's fine and it works. But if Glitch Trap is Afton possessing the Mimic, what is the point of the Mimic being Glitch Trap at all? But what a lot of people are misinterpreting about theories regarding the Mimic mimicking Afton is thinking that people believe the Mimic always mimics only Afton, or just misinterpreting what the Mimic mimics at all. We learned from HandUnit in FNaF VR that Fazbear Entertainment probably wanted the VR game to come out as quickly as possible, and they sent Silver Parasol circuit boards that could be used to create performances and behaviors of characters from the past instantly, so they wouldn't have to do it themselves. These circuit boards are what created Glitch Trap. Since the circuit boards were used as a shortcut to replicate past characters, it seems clear that the circuit boards provided by Fazbear Entertainment contained the Mimic program. That program was used to mimic old characters. The final minigame of Help Wanted, Pizza Party, is all about Afton murdering a child. Since that's part of the actual game, it seems that the Mimic began to mimic the Spring Bonnie Man from that minigame, which is how he ends up mimicking Afton. Information about the murders were put into this game, and the Mimic program began to mimic Afton through those. But what people don't realize about this is that the Mimic is not only mimicking Afton. He was used to recreate many different FNaF VR characters, and we actually do get a sign that even now he is still mimicking some of them. What we see of the Mimic in Ruin shows that he mimics other characters too. One of, if not the only similarity that the Mimic in Ruin has with Burntrap is his hand with claws on it, but that hand is actually based on the design of the Nightmares who did appear in FNaF VR. We also know Glitchtrap had mimicked Tape Girl at one point, though I'm not sure if he still would be. The Mimic in Ruin is also definitely the same one from the epilogues. Not only does he have a lot of mixed up parts that don't match one another, which matches how the Mimic in its own story was repaired by a bunch of Fazbear employees who gave it legs and fixed its parts, but it also has the same white eyes that glow orange, and the description matches outside of the ears, which probably just broke off. The Mimic in the epilogues is also said to have a new replaced head. Considering the purpose for which Edwin made the Mimic, I find it hard to believe that it has a work mode. However, Fazbear Entertainment mass-produced Mimic Model 2s, which I can definitely believe have a work mode. It's very likely that the Mimic's head was too damaged and was replaced with the head of a Mimic Model 2. That Mimic Model 2 then allowed the Mimic in the epilogues to have work mode, and the work mode is used to make it rip off the limbs and heads of endoskeletons, which it also extends to humans. The Mimic in the epilogues is not mimicking Afton, it's simply doing what it's programmed to do. It's also worth mentioning that the teeth of the Mimic, which as I said came from the Mimic Model 2 since it's a part of the head, match the teeth of the daycare attendant. The daycare attendant was revealed in Bobby Dots Part 1 to have come from a stage show, and Fazbear Entertainment took it and transformed it into Sun and Moon, and also made all the proper Fazbear adjustments. Considering they had the Mimic Model 2 head ready to go to replace the Mimic Model 1's head, it's entirely possible they used a Mimic Model 2 to equip the daycare attendant with all the proper technology. As I said, the Mimic in the epilogues isn't mimicking Afton. The 7th Tales epilogue shows his perspective and shows that he's simply trying to fulfill his programming. This version of the Mimic has not yet been exposed to Afton's crimes. However, it's still the Mimic and is still mimicking people. Afton simply isn't one of them yet. However, we do still see signs of him mimicking Edwin and David. Edwin due to the aggression exposed to him when he beat the Mimic senseless, and David because of the whole thing about hiding in costumes. The Mimic doesn't hide in costumes because of Afton, he does that because he used to always do it with David. The Mimic program, likely from the head that was taken away from the original Mimic, also ended up being used for the Storyteller in the Pizzaplex. That would also explain why the Storyteller is only a head. Maybe the actual Mimic animatronic head is in there and the tiger is like built around it. That might not be the case, but it could make sense. And with that, we also see signs of Edwin and David. The animatronics affected by the Mimic began acting both more aggressive, especially in the case of Monty, but Freddy also acts like a spoiled brat, almost like he's a little kid, just like David. That version of the Mimic also ended up in the VR booth in the form of Tiger Rock, and Tiger Rock rips off limbs just like the Mimic does in the epilogues. Since both of them run the same piece of the program, it's very likely that they have a sort of hive mind. The Mimic in the epilogues only begins ripping off limbs because of its programming with the work mode, so it's likely that the hive mind of the Mimic caused the Pizzaplex Mimic to also begin ripping off arms and legs. So taking into account all of that, how do all the different Mimics affect each other? Well, what I'll be doing now is explaining the timeline of the Mimic, starting from 1984 when he was first created and ending around 2030 or so when Ruin takes place. The Mimic was first created in 1984 by Edwin to entertain his 4-year-old son David while he worked on animatronics for Fazbear Entertainment. The Mimic was an endoskeleton which ran a program called Mimic 1, which Edwin made with very unconventional pathways that most programmers frowned upon, but they were a shortcut to making the endoskeleton as quickly as possible. The Mimic 1 program observed all behavior it saw around it and replicated it, and when Edwin's son David started playing with it, it mimicked everything David did. It watches David do things like hanging up clothes on a hanger in a closet, dressing up in costumes, putting things away in the fridge, but one day, David tragically gets hit by a car and dies. Edwin then gets horrified to see the Mimic still acting like David. Now, with nothing new to copy from David, he starts observing Edwin, who is so angry that he beats the Mimic senseless, thus teaching the Mimic aggression. Months later, a few Fazbear teams were sent to the factory Edwin worked at to scavenge the things Edwin had built, but all of them get killed by the Mimic. But the Mimic kills them using methods that he had seen from David, like putting things in the fridge and hanging up clothes. But because of the aggression it had learned from Edwin, it did these things very aggressively and to humans, and all of them die. It also does these things while dressed up in costumes just like it would with David. Over the course of the next 30 years or so, Fazbear Entertainment had eventually retrieved the Mimic and used the concept of it to create a new Mimic model, a Model 2, but they also still had the first Mimic. After the events of FNaF 6, they replaced the head of the Mimic with that of a Mimic Model 2, giving the original Mimic the features of a Mimic Model 2, and sent the original Mimic to the under construction Pizzaplex. An employee on the renovation team for the FNaF 6 building was getting tired of clearing out all the animatronic endoskeletons and decided that the Mimic didn't seem like it would be performing for the Pizzaplex, so he took it and used it to work mode, programming it to clear out all the endoskeletons for them, ripping off all limbs and heads. The Mimic did this, but once it was finished with the endoskeletons, it moved on to ripping off the limbs and heads of the renovation crew. A bunch of people die, and the FNaF 6 pizzeria, which was planned to become a museum, was blocked off, trapping the Mimic inside. Kids break in, and the Mimic kills almost all of them, and the pizzeria from FNaF 6 is left buried under the Pizzaplex. While this is happening, Fazbear Entertainment is working on a VR game to try and discredit the rumors of the murders that happened in Fazbear's past. They send circuit boards with the Mimic program to the company making the game as a shortcut to making the animatronics act the way they should. It works, but the Mimic manifests as a Spring Bonnie character, now mimicking William Afton's persona. The Mimic in this form, aka Glitchtrap, possesses people including Vanessa. She ends up later getting a job at the Pizzaplex and going underneath, fixing up the Mimic and creating Burntrap. Whether the Mimic and Burntrap are the same or not is still debated, but either way, both of these things do happen. The Mimic also possesses Gregory, who ends up being Patient 46. Going back a little bit, when the Pizzaplex opens, Fazbear Entertainment uses the Mimic program from the Mimic's damaged head and repurposes it for the Storyteller, which would mimic the old story writers for the Pizzaplex to create the Fazbear Entertainment stories, making it so that the Fazbear Entertainment company didn't have to spend so much money on those employees, thus reducing the overall expenses of the Pizzaplex. Edwin, who is now 64 years old and still working for Fazbear Entertainment, tries to sever the Storyteller's connection from the Pizzaplex because it was causing the animatronics to act more eerily and childish and aggressive. Edwin ends up dying along with the Fazbear board chairman, and the animatronics are now acting strangely and a lot more so than usual. But soon enough they would be acting even worse. Gregory, possessed by Glitchtrap, takes the Mimic program, the one evolved to mimic Afton, the Glitchtrap virus itself, and hacks into the Pizzaplex systems, now merging the two different pieces of the Mimic together. Now, Glitchtrap and the Storyteller Mimic, which is still in the Pizzaplex despite the Storyteller's tree being removed, are put together and are basically one and the same. Previously, they were two separate pieces of the Mimic, but now they are the same, causing the Mimic's endoskeleton to now mimic William Afton himself as well. A few years after all that, the Glitchtrap virus is destroyed during the Princess Quest ending, leaving the animatronics to go back to how they were before Glitchtrap was introduced into them. They act as they were when the Storyteller caused them to become more aggressive and childish, meaning their personalities are still different to how they originally were, but they aren't evil. The Mimic endoskeleton itself is also now back in work mode as it was in the Tales epilogues, now just trying to get more endoskeleton-like beings to come down so it can rip off all their limbs and heads. But that's everything there is to talk about in this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to. I haven't been uploading as much recently as I've started school now, but while they may or may not be uploaded quite often, I do have a bunch of videos planned that I think you guys will find interesting, so keep an eye out. But that's all, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys!